recent work of mine. I'm going to share my screen, and this is work that we've conducted at UCL with a goal, in a certain sense, of not only working on a topic which I think everyone can somehow relate to, but also trying to show that even in topics that are of relevance and interest to the person on the street, linguistics does matter. The details of linguistic theory does matter. And I want to show you a case where it actually takes some linguistic theory to understand the pattern of results that we have in a domain which is intriguing and I think calls for a lot of further work. Hopefully you'll be interested enough to do further work. The work that I'm going to tell you about does involve intoxicating participants, that is, bringing volunteers to the laboratory here, Chandler House in the middle of London, and yeah, I mean, actually getting them drunk to a level, blood alcohol level of 0.1% or so. And this did require ethics permission from the university, but we got it, and I'm happy to share the ethics permission details with anybody who wants to try to replicate this at your own university, because it's actually possible. It's a bit of a headache, but it's actually possible with the right kind of protocols. So with that, let me show you my slides. And the research that I want to tell you about today it involves two studies. The first one was published just recently last year in the journal JASA, the Journal of the Acoustic Society of America, with the list of authors that you see here, with a slightly different title. But if you look for my former student Kevin Tang and myself, you'll find this publication. And today it's a more general set of topics at what I call the ethanol, which is one of the more scientific names for alcohol, phonetics interface. I want to start by showing you a picture of my refrigerator, which has a sticker from a beer label from this nice guava flavored Brazilian beer, but also this magnet next to it that says the vinho triplica la capacité de parlare other languages, which looks like it's in Mignonese, but it also reflects this common perception that we have that maybe by ingesting perhaps just, in fact, the right amount of alcohol, your ability to speak a second language or a third language, a non-native language, improves. So I have this on my fridge as a constant reminder of the commonplace perception that's out there, but one which, to be honest, hasn't received quite enough empirical testing. And that's what we're here to look at, but again, specifically with its interaction with linguistically informed set of predictions. So the outline for today, we'll look at some of the intoxication effects on speech. We'll look at the questions of bilingualism and pitch. I think that this talk will be of interest to people who are in general interested in multilingualism, which is, of course, always a hot topic, but particularly in today's world, and the research questions, the methodology, results, and future directions. So it's long been known that alcohol affects speech production, and one of the most well-known areas of phonetics where there's an effect is pitch. In fact, some of you may remember in the 1980s, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which was when a big oil tanker around the area of Alaska crashed and, in fact, killed lots of marine wildlife because of the huge amount of oil that spilled. And when they were trying to prosecute the captain of the ship, they were able to prove that he was drunk, that he was intoxicated, by using forensic linguistics on his radio messages. So actually, a lot of forensic linguistics has studied pitch and alcohol specifically because of this intoxication, which can lead to higher what's called F0, fundamental frequency variability in sober speech, where your pitch range can go up or down to a greater range than it would. And what this has often been pegged to from a articulatory point of view is less precise control of the rate of vocal cord vibration, for the same reason that drinking alcohol and operating heavy machinery or vehicles at high speed is generally shunned as a bad idea. It's because precise motor and muscular control is impaired. We know that's a fact about the way that alcohol works, and the vocal folds are no exception. So this finding of increased F0 variability in intoxicated speech is one that's been replicated in a number of studies. And in fact, in languages outside of English, and there are what are called individual differences in F0 levels. So if you look at this table, this is a sort of meta study across, as you see here. I have someone at my door. Hello, I'm giving a lecture. You better be fine.
I was going to do the Zoom check first.
Yeah. We have here, I don't know, a dozen studies that are conducted across a range of languages, sometimes with males, sometimes with females. And you see that for all of these, even though maybe to some degrees the average F0 may change, the range always increases. Okay, the range of your pitch envelope will increase across different languages as a function of intoxication. This is across also a variety of blood alcohol levels. So because of this wide range of research, as I say, much of it is from forensic linguistics. Some of it is also looking at male-female sociolinguistic differences. But we know that there is a large range of how pitch control is affected by intoxication. And what Baumeister found is that German speakers increase their mean F0 and their range, whereas Japanese speakers actually decrease their mean F0, but still expand their range. So this expansion of the F0 range is part and parcel of intoxication, specifically on the muscles of the vocal folds. Now, at the same time, we're aware that cross-linguistic variability can be influenced by what are normally called the three main types of F0 languages. Intonation languages, these are languages like English and German, and of course, as I know from studying, Russian, where intonation is extremely important for different speech types, for illocutionary force, for distinguishing, assertions, commands, imperatives, and interrogatives. Pitch accent languages. This is a category which actually Larry Hyman, whose initials LMH, low, mid, high, make him very good at studying pitch, looks at the fact that Japanese is what's sometimes called a restricted tone language. So these are languages that have one syllable within the word that has the higher pitch of all. You've got minimal triplets like in Japanese, hashionoru, 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 and that's those are the minimal triplet, which differs only in where the high pitch is. The South Slavic languages, such as Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, have also been classified as pitch accent languages. These are languages that have at most one, but sometimes zero high tones assigned to a particular syllable within a word. And finally, tonal languages like Mandarin Chinese, which many of you are familiar with, can have at least a 5-way contrast on ma, 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 and ma. So the first one means mother, the second one means horse, the third means hemp, the third one means horse, the fourth one means to scold, and the fifth one is a question mark, toneless. So mama, ma, ma, ma means did mother scold the horse? So those three different kinds of ways of using F0 are different functional roles for the same phonetic ingredient. That is, different languages choose different ways to make use of this dimension. We have F0 either for sentence level intonation, for lexical tone, or for pitch accent, which is something that's kind of in between, but as Larry Hyman would say, probably closer to a tone language with more restrictions on its tone. Now, although there have been people in different labs that have studied alcohol and its cross-linguistic effects, not too many people have studied intoxicated speech from a cross-linguistic perspective. And that was our aim here. Now, it is also known that, of course, one way that variation can manifest itself is through the experience and proficiency in the target language. And probably one of the first studies that we found, and maybe earlier, but the earliest one we found from 1972 looked at English speakers who were producing novel sentences of Thai, the Thai language from Thailand, and found that although on your first language, alcohol decreased your ability to be what was called globally fluent in your first language, your production in your second language was actually rated by people as being improved. Now, this is surprising, right? Why should drinking alcohol make your first language worse and make your second language better? Does this have to do with the general questions that we look at in bilingualism and second language acquisition, namely language ego? And this does matter. Every time I open my mouth in Russian, I get worried I'm going to make a mistake about a case. I already have a thing on my shoulder that says you're going to make a mistake. And so that nervousness, which children obviously don't have when they learn their L1, they just make mistakes and just go along and at some point get to their target. That what's called language ego in the sometime is potentially what's being affected by alcohol in this particular study. Wieling et al. In a paper entitled Dutch Courage looked at Dutch English bilinguals and found that they actually had a worse clarity of L1 under alcohol consumption, but no effect on their native likeness of L2 English. So there aren't actually too many studies that have looked at second language acquisition in alcohol. There are a lot that have looked at pitch on L1, but not very many that have looked at second language acquisition. These two are the main ones, including to our own. So this is an area that's ripe for further research, and this is why we did the present study. Okay, any questions so far, actually? This is meant to be an interactive lecture series. You don't need to hold your questions all the way to the end. I see there are at least 5 messages in the chat, and I'm going to pop out to see what you have to say. Okay, Camille says the ethanol part is understanding. I had to keep things a little mysterious there in the title. Anyone have any other questions or comments when we've got to this point? It can even be about terminology, right? I realize that many of you may not be familiar with all the terminology or even methodology we use. And so, the main reason that I'm here is to have a dialogue and to welcome you and fill in gaps that you may have in your background. Any questions at this point?
Hey, I have a question.
Yes.
Hi. So yeah, it's a really interesting study. I think I'm really curious about this concept of language ego, and I was wondering to what extent that, I think, at least from my previous class, there is some distinction within linguistics between like psychology and, ego and self-esteem and all of that, and like language and linguistic ability and like the ability to acquire and use language. But it seems like language ego may be like a bridge between the two, like you perhaps are, I don't know, like I'm just trying to make sense of it, if that makes sense. So I was wondering if you could please elaborate. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. The concept as it's used in second language literature varies quite a bit. And you're right, it's a kind of bridge between psychology and linguistics. And it might, like many such cases, benefit from more studies that look at, let's say, maybe having a more detailed questionnaire set of ratings where people might even rate their own language ego and their own confidence, let's say, in various aspects of their language. And I'd say, as I say, if I were to rate my confidence in Russian, it would be low because I would know that I always worried about making case errors. So yeah, I think it's something that can be studied quantitatively. And I think, again, it might be exactly what makes differences between L1 and L2, where, children don't have a notion of a language ego or making mistakes. And perhaps that's what allows language acquisition to flourish unfettered in a way that for adults, we have constantly looming these perhaps doubts about, accuracy.
Yeah.
Another idea that
Please go
yeah,
on.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that, one thing that, I'm kind of like that. I just think I'm good at everything, even before doing it. And then if I'm not good at it, I think there's something wrong with the way that it's being taught.
Well, that's an excellent heuristic for life. I don't blame you at all there.
Yeah.
But the fringe.
Carol Dweck and the growth mindset. Sorry, that's the last thing I'll say.
What was that?
Carol Dweck from Stanford and the growth mindset, as opposed to the fixed mindset when it comes to learning. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that certainly this is an area that is ripe for bridges with psychology. And in fact, I'm very happy that in this building where I am, linguistics is part of the psychology and language sciences department. We're not part of humanities and literature. Although I think literature is a wonderful topic, it's very nice to be integrated with psychologists because there are very clear bridges, particularly as my own approach to language and linguistics comes from a cognitive science background. So I'm always welcome to see those kind of bridges. And thank you for bringing that up. Camille, what are big five characteristics, in fact? I don't know what that is.
Because there was a question about bridging psychology and linguistics. Big Five is this most prominent psychological test to assess your creativeness and neuroticness, and it's very reliable. So I think if we speak about ego, it's important to talk also about this Big Five data, which is ubiquitously used by psychologists to establish the character of a person. That's just a question, side note, yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is one reason why I really love coming to this school and in fact giving lectures to diverse audiences, is that I learn a lot, you know, and I was not aware of that. I know there are many different profile tests, and that one may be relevant, particularly for looking at this question of ego. Yeah, thank you. So there are these bridges that are possible to psychology, and I'm actually somewhat surprised there haven't been more. But of course, given that my interest in our specialty is actually working with a lot of different kinds of languages, we wanted to actually look at different languages simultaneously. So let me show you a bit about how that works, and then we can jump back to another discussion. And so there have been studies, again, looking at English speakers learning Thai that show some improved performance, although decreased performance in their L1, and a Dutch study that showed decrease in L1 and no improvement in L2. There have been, on the other hand, outside of the domain of alcohol, a number of studies that look at bilingualism and the question of when we speak another language, does that other language live in a different part of our brain, or is that a shared control mechanism? And this has been looked at a bit. So the question of whether, for example, in pairings like L1 Dutch, L2 Greek, or L1 German, L2 English, or L1 Welsh and L2 English, or L1 English and L2 Korean, is there a evidence for the idea that your pitch control in your native language is transferred over in very specific ways to your second language? So that, you don't simply have two completely distinct centers for each language, but you actually reuse some of the same kind of control mechanisms in your second language. And there is, with one of my co-authors, Charles Chang, this notion that there is a shared control mechanism that underlies RF0, no matter which language we speak. So the two research questions that I'd like to crystallize this into are, does intoxication affect pitch variability similarly across different languages? In particular, of tonal and non-tonal languages. And second, sequential bilinguals, not simultaneous, but sequential bilinguals who are very fluent in a second language, do they show similar effects of alcohol on their L1 as they do on their L2? So these are distinct but related questions. So we had participants of German, Korean, and Mandarin Chinese come to the lab here downstairs. We wanted to make sure that they were L2 speakers of English with a good degree of proficiency. I'll talk about that, and no alcohol related or other health problems that were relevant. And we recruited for this study, this was partly some student projects, 8 speakers of German, 8 of Korean, and 17 of Mandarin, roughly all in their 20s. Most of them lived in the UK for 1 or 2 years at the time of study, and we looked at their proficiency data, which were upper intermediate or lower advanced, And we used either their scores on the standardized Yelts test, or we actually used this tool that I'd recommend to many of you called Lextail. And Lextail basically does a lexical decision task very quickly. It says, tell me, is this a word of English? Sponge, and it sees how long you take to reply. And then, is this a word of English? Persnickety, and sees how long you take to reply, and uses that, your reaction time in a lexical decision task of English, as a measure, as a stand-in for proficiency. And so we use that also to make sure that in our groups, the speakers of these different languages were roughly of the same proficiency level in their English. And what we have people do, and I think this is very important to talk about from the point of view of methodology, if you have people come to the lab and just talk about whatever they want, you're going to get data that's very hard to compare across not only the different languages, but also across their L1 and L2, across their sober and intoxicated. So what we did was had people read plays. Why did we have them read plays? Well, plays are conversational, but they still are a script. Okay, so we had these different plays, the Gonkot oder die Abschaffung des Todes, the Coffee Prince, Two Dogs' Opinion on Life, and The Good Doctor. And these were plays that they read, I think that last one is Neil Simon, in their various languages or in English. We had to edit the texts so that it was somewhat gender neutral, had removal of archaic words, had a good amount of turn taking between each of the interlocutors, and was representative of the target languages inventory. And if you want to look at the materials, the link here is for you on this open science framework, which is a repository where anyone can look at the data that's been used in an experiment as a shared way of what's sometimes called replicability in psychology. So people went to this sound isolated room in our phonetics lab, and they read, along with our experimenter, who was a native speaker of German or Korean or Mandarin, 2 target dialogues. The participant read one, the experiment read the other, and we had the same person come back. They would do it either in a sober session or an intoxicated session. And in the intoxicated session, we made sure that they didn't eat, drink, or use mouthwash or smoke beforehand because of effects of that on metabolism of alcohol. And we also, tried to counterbalance the odor so that there wasn't particularly a benefit to having read the text first sober and then coming back and then intoxicated. We bought a breathalyzer for this, the same thing that the police use, and we try to give people a target BAC of 0.12%. In the United States, at least in California, 0.08% is the legal limit for driving. So this is considerably higher. And we would mix together either vodka or rum with juice. People would drink it at their own pace. And then we would measure their BAC every 3 to 5 minutes to get them to 0.12. And then, if they were higher, let it drop down. As soon as it was 0.12, they were considered intoxicated enough for the experiment. Okay, any questions about this procedure before we proceed? Lots of discussion about the big five. Sorry, Nadia?
Yes. Do you take into account the weight of the participant?
That is a very interesting question. So we measured their blood alcohol level and needed to dose them appropriately. My friend Patricia says vodka and apple juice seems disgusting. She's obviously never had Polish Zubrowka, which is excellent with apple juice. But yeah, they had their choice of mixers. I see a hand from my old friend Anna Sedova.
Hello. So I have also a question about that different people, and actually people from different races, they have like different resistance to alcohol. So did you work with that? So for example, we say that people from Mongolia, they can't resist alcohol as, for example, people like white-skinned people and stuff. So also this matters, I think, because you're talking about Korean and Chinese Mandarin. So, I mean, alcohol affects those people differently as well.
It's true that there are certainly, it's known to be studies of some, certainly not, I'm not an expert on that, genetic differences in the processing of alcohol. We also did have, unfortunately, some unfortunate cleanup situations we had to do in the lab for some participants who really had some difficulties. But there's also what's called individual variability. And actually, one of the most difficult parts of our ethics was that we would not be able to let people out of the lab when the experiment was over until they were down to 0.05, which was a safe level. And for some of the participants, that meant that they had to stick around in the lab for like 2 hours. We had to stay and babysit them after the experiment was over. So that was actually the hardest part. But to be honest with you, you know, although what you say is certainly something that could be studied, my expertise is as a linguist. And so I wanted to study potential variability due to the language they spoke, not necessarily to their ethanol metabolizing genetics. That could be studied, and I hope someone do, and I'd love to.
But I think it also, I mean, it also it can affect your your research, because you can't like put into a personal. So languages are different, and what we were talking about. Sorry, I missed like 13 minutes of your lecture.
13. Well, what I'd like you to do is pay close,
13 minutes.
pay close attention to the next 13. And once I show you the results, what I want you to do is come back to me, and once you actually see the results, say whether you think whether your hypothesis might have any bearing on them or not. So keep that in mind as a way of staying engaged. Keep your hypothesis in mind and see whether actually you think it will be able to explain the results. And I think that's a nice suspense for everybody there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Masha.
Hi, hello. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And maybe I should also wait for the results, but I was kind of curious about your choice of stimuli, them being plays. Because yeah, I mean, of course you don't want spontaneous speech, right? What if drunk people use more exclamatives or something? Then there's an interaction you don't want. Or even like in a language like Russian, even questions, right, might give rise to higher pitch excursions. But plays, I'm curious. So, what do you think about the potential? The idea that people who are drunk might be more willing to convey more affect when they to perform more as characters, and therefore convey more affect, and possibly again result in higher pitch excursions when they're drunk. Because you said we're going to remove like emotional text or something, but like any text can be emotional, right?
Sure.
And especially if you have something as strong as a play where there is like a high potential for empathy and whatnot, and like trying to create empathy. So did you try to account for that?
No, I think it's interesting to think about the text. I'm glad that you recognize the importance of the balance between not having sort of completely free production and having some kind of script, and also wanting to have a script that was dialogue with turn taking, and also wanting to have a script that was kind of interest. So I think there are many potential texts that could be used. This is what we did. And again, take a look at the results, and would like to see what you think after that if we have time. Thank you for the comment, though. It's always important to think about alternatives. And again, this is an area ripe for replication with different materials. Patricia.
So I wanted to ask about the idea of language ego, and instead ask, well, what about the idea of a suppression of inhibition? Because I think research shows that if you are instructed to consciously pay attention to patterns, you are much worse at pattern following and pattern recognition than if you pay no attention or very little attention. So is the idea of inhibition, like lack of inhibition, really closely related to language ego? So actually we can kind of don't need to distinguish that. I mean, I was just thinking of the pattern recognition.
Yeah, I think that there's good work that could probably be done. And I mentioned earlier in response to the earlier question about how maybe this notion of language ego could be potentially fragmented into, sub questions and even, self-evaluation. But yeah, I think it's certainly related to the notion of inhibition, right? So if you have.
Yeah, I also think there's like a fairly recent work on L2 processing that shows that L1 speakers use kind of a good enough strategy very often, but L2 speakers use a more precise strategy. And so again, it's just related to difference in inhibition or, well, attention. Yeah, so.
That's great. That's wonderful. That's a wonderful suggestion. Thank you. I'm gonna look for that. Yeah, I think that what's nice about the particular study I have here is that it relates L1, L2 research with typology, with the specific alcohol specific effects. So let me turn to the bit more on the methods and then the results, and then we'll come back for a discussion. Does anyone have any other questions on the methodology of breathalyzers or this as we go on? So to do the analysis, we broke each utterance up into, well, it broke each checks up in utterances roughly by what's according to breath group. And we did an acoustic analysis of both duration and F0 and wanted to look in terms of each window for the standard deviation or variability in the F0. So, okay, so we tried to take all these different utterances and we had to exclude obviously ones that were disfluent or with noise, but looked at these particular windows of analysis and the pitch. And in terms of the statistics, looked at how F0 variability varied with respect to duration, gender, the group of speakers that we're interested in, the condition, whether sober or drunk, and then also looked at all of these interactions. Okay, and so what you see here in this graph is that the Germans in their L1 had certainly an increase in their pitch standard deviation. And that's something that was already found by Baumeister's group, that there is this increased pitch variation in German under intoxication when they're speaking their own language, when they're speaking their own L1. But in Korean and Mandarin, no such effect. In Korean and Mandarin, no such effect. And actually, this is one of the first studies to look at Korean and Mandarin alcohol on L1 and find no real effect of the condition. Now, there is obviously some effect on duration. So utterances that are longer are going to have more variation in them because you have more time to do more variation. And there is a slight gender difference with males showing lower variability than females, although I don't have a specific hypothesis about that today that I want to talk about. If you do and you want to talk about it, it should be very interesting to think about. But there's no hypothesis specifically from linguistics that I could draw on for that, but it's still an effect in our data that I wanted to report. So the finding here shows you that in an L1, depending on the role of F0, the effect of alcohol that we all might expect to be automatic. More alcohol means more pitch variability in the vocal folds. It depends on what language you speak. So if your L1 is German, then you might have more, as you also do with English. If you speak an intonation language, where the functional role of pitch doesn't matter so much for lexical contrasts, then you would have perhaps, so it'd be interesting to look at a whole range of other languages that fall along this continuum, but at least for these three groups, there was no effect in Korean or Mandarin on having an increased variability reading the same plays, either sober or intoxicated across these conditions. Now, what about in the L2? Now, this is where things get a bit, sorry, let's look at L1 just one more time. So in L1, these plots also show you, if you look at the blue lines, that there are more blue lines going up in German than there are in Korean or Mandarin. So the German group had the intoxication effect more than the other two. Okay, and there was more variability in general in intoxication, but the effect was larger for German. Now, what about the L2? Okay, this is where things get interesting. It turns out that you have a similar effect in your L1 as in your L2. That is, it turns out that if you look now just in each of these plots at where the means are, in these box and whiskers plots that you find that also in the L2 in German, there is an increase in variability, but for Korean and Mandarin, there is not. Okay. What does this suggest? This suggests that if you speak a tone language, number one, on the effects of alcohol are going to be smaller on your pitch range because you speak a tone language. Speaking a tone language will, in a way, inhibit the normal effect of alcohol on pitch variability, and also in your L2 as well. So the surprising finding here is that, for example, Mandarin speakers, because they speak a tone language, do not vary their pitch more when they're drunk in their L1 Mandarin or in their English. So this is the first study that has compared pitch control under intoxication between speakers of tonal languages and non-tonal languages. Okay, and this takes linguistics to do, right? A psychologist who's looking at the effects of alcohol might not think, okay, what are the effects of being a tonal language or not? But what this suggests is that a shared control mechanism is there. So maybe it's not so surprising that if you are a Mandarin speaker, you don't vary your pitch as much under alcohol as English or German speakers. But it is surprising that even when you speak English as a Mandarin speaker, you also retain that greater degree of control. And now let's think back to our friend Anna Sedova's question. Is it the case that East Asian speakers have less control under alcohol? Well, they actually show more control under alcohol. Right? The Mandarin and Korean speakers actually were more controlled in their pitch than the German speakers, despite whatever genetics or archaeology may tell us about alcohol ingestion and its traditions in those various places. What seemed to be more relevant than the genetics or the archaeology or the culture was the language. If it's a tonal language, you retain control over your pitch under alcohol, both in your L1, but even in your L2 English. And for Korean, this is particularly interesting because this overall pitch control helps us perhaps with this question of whether Korean should be classified as a tone language or as a kind of pitch accent language, and its patterning with Mandarin. So here's a very interesting question. Can we use intoxication to do prosodic classification? There's this whole continuum of languages on this pitch accent F0 use, Basque, Japanese, Swedish, and could one use alcohol to look at the relative effect of each under pitch control with alcohol? In principle, one could. Now, there is also very interesting question of what if we had different L1, L2 pairings. So in this study, we used English, a non-tonal language, as the L2. But what if you used a tonal language as the L2, right? If you were to, for example, look at L1 speakers of English speaking Mandarin as their L2, you know, people who have studied Chinese, would they show less overall pitch control under intoxication? Would we find the opposite effect again, depending on what your native language is? If you're a Chinese speaker speaking English, in your L2 under alcohol, you maintain control. If, for example, you're an English speaker speaking Chinese under L2, do you show less pitch control? The pairings matter. And one of the things that makes L2 research so interesting and exciting is looking at all of these different pairings of the L1 and the L2 cross typologically distinct profiles and pairings. Now, there are some limitations of this study, and I think Masha's is perhaps pointing at that, the question about this being, for example, read speech. So actually, read speech is thought to show smaller effects of intoxication than other speaking styles. There are even, you know, Baumeister and others have looked at speaking styles that involve kind of where you give people various kinds of commands in games, and you say, okay, move the blue square over to the red. So is reading actually something that has less variability than other kinds of controlled stimuli? And of course, we haven't really completed the role of gender here because I don't have a strong hypothesis about that, but certainly this difference in F0 modulation across languages under alcohol and without alcohol is something that our study replicated. that I think for people who do have hypothesis-driven research about this could be worth exploring further. Now, there are other studies that look at, for example, how does alcohol affect your ability to play darts? Okay. And I think this is relevant because in a way, playing darts has a target, right? And we know from these studies of playing darts that actually some alcohol might even help some dart throwers, but of course, too much will make their ability to play darts go down drastically. But the question, perhaps related to what Patricia was talking about, is why might alcohol improve your ability to play darts? And is it because many of us, when we speak a second language, we have habits, we're stuck sort of in what you might call local maxima. So we've got a very okay way of pronouncing that difficult vowel I, and we do it and we manage to get it, but alcohol is just enough to throw us off and maybe get us out of our local maxima and onto a higher hill here that has an even higher maximum. It's just the right amount of alcohol, enough to shake up this notion of a target, like a dart. And of course, we're talking about an acoustic and articulatory target, but the notion of motor control that plays a role in darts might be something that has interesting parallels in speech as well. Also anticipated by a number of questions, such as Camille's, are the question of what other individual differences might one look at in terms of working memory, in terms of perceptual acuity outside of linguistics, and a number of other quotients. And finally, something that actually forensic linguistics does look at a lot is sleep deprivation. What are the parallels between the effects of alcohol on speech and sleep deprivation on speech? Now, the final study I'd like to tell you about, which is not in the paper, the JASA paper, for those of you who want to read it, but is work we've now done with additional students who have looked at this, are cross-linguistic differences in what's called compactness. And it turns out that if we want to now look at specific vowels, we find that, well, of course, we're looking at different languages that have different vowel spaces. English and German have more crowded vowel spaces than Mandarin and Korean. And it turns out that there are certain individuals who have more compact vowel spaces than others. What does this mean? Well, I'll show you. A picture's worth 1,000 words. But there are some individuals who every time they pronounce an A, every token is close to each other. Whereas there are other individuals whose tokens of A may vary more broadly. And some people simply have a phonetic, let's say, OCD, and every token of A is exactly the same, and others have their tokens of A that are a more broad cloud. Now, again, a question we might ask is, does intoxication level the playing field such that, for example, people who are very compact, people who are medium compact might end up in their L2 hitting the target better? Okay, this is something that with darts, there isn't a true analog. Although the dart studies are interesting to compare to language, there's no notion of an L1 and an L2 in darts that we can draw on in a clear way. Yeah. So, I mean, one hypothesis that we could think of, and that's very tempting, is the reason that there is this intuition that speaking a second language is better under alcohol is maybe because we're so good at our first language that it gets in the way. And that by bringing our first language down a notch, it allows us to see over the parapet to our second language. So that's a hypothesis you could entertain, and let's look at that with respect to our data. So here I have two different individuals. The first one is very compact. This is Korean speaker 004. And the second one is much more diffuse. This is Korean speaker 006. Now, what we find is that their vowel spaces do tend to expand under intoxication, much like the pitch range. But actually, pitch range, as you recall, in Korean and Mandarin, stayed under control depending on the functional load, if it was a tone language or not. Whereas for vowels, in all cases, they seem to expand, whether or not we have compact or non-compact individuals. The area for a given vowel tended to be larger in intoxicated than in sober speech. But in general, what we see, and now this is German speaker 0005 versus German speaker 0006. Again, a more compact versus a more diffuse speaker, is that the bilinguals with more compact vowels, while they were sober, also produced more compact vowels while they were intoxicated. And this was whether they spoke their L1 or L2. So this now suggests again that there's a shared control mechanism of compactness that's not again really affected by alcohol. It doesn't level the playing field, but this notion of individual differences are retained when speaking a second language. So these individual differences in compactness persist across conditions and through this bilingual, sorry about that text there, repertoire. And this suggests that our notion of articulatory precision, if we want to call it that way, is stable, even across L1, L2, and across alcohol. So then we get the question, well, why did some speakers, and where does this general intuition come from that alcohol improves a second language? It doesn't seem to change pitch range, and it doesn't seem to change compactness. Maybe it improves some notion of accentedness in a global sense. Maybe things like speech rate and pauses are something that change in an L2. That we haven't studied yet. So where does the intuition come from? Can we look also at interesting pairings of what would your L2 versus your L3 be looking like? And finally, your vocabulary size. This is a reason, again, relevant to Masha's question, to maybe have free production. So the studies or the intuitions that suggest that, for example, alcohol improves your second language, is that because of a greater range of lexical items, or is that a greater diversity of lexical items? Is that somehow related to vocabulary size, vocabulary diversity, as you're speaking a second language, that you more freely pick up words that you wouldn't necessarily while sober? That also requires comparison with different kind of methodology and studies. So I really just wanted to share this research with you as it's at this nexus of looking at a number of areas in L1, L2, in bilingualism, in pitch control, and in typology. And now I'd invite you, well, of course, depending on what time zone you're in, to conduct your own empirical and formal studies on this topic with me. In the question period, I saw someone already had a goblet. Thank you very much for your interest, and again, for your participation, and to John for organizing tirelessly every year for the last 20 years this school, despite all the challenges, and manages to thrive. Right, so now I have some questions here I can look at.
Yeah, you can take your own questions. Thank you, Andrew. And you're welcome to. We still have, a good 15 minutes for discussion and questions. So
great, yeah. I wanted to
you can do that. You can handle that yourself.
Supposed to clock in at about an hour, so it's good to have some time.
Yeah, hour and 15 if we want to have more discussion. That's fine. Thank you.
Camille asks about code switching and code mixing. And I think that's an excellent topic, of course, one that might require definitely a different methodology than the one we have here, right? This would require kind of free production. So, yeah, did you have specifics? Did you want to? I mean, people type things along the way, but now we have the time and luxury to expand on that. Camille, did you want to expand on what specific ideas you might have with respect to code mixing?
No, not really. That was just a question thrown into the wild spectrum of possibilities. I think just it might be interesting to look forward to, well, more research on that. Yeah, no further questions.
Thank you. And again, I just want to emphasize that I'm sure you'll run across people informally who will say that, oh yes, alcohol affects a second language. And if you just remember one thing from this talk, I want you to remember, well, what kind of language, right? Is it a tone language or a non-tone language? Does linguistic theory and typology help us inform the notion of how your L1 and L2 pairings might not actually always have the same effects? So Patricia mentions heritage language effects.
So I was just, so suppose your L1 is a tone language and you have very significant attrition, whether there still is this control effect of your pitch while intoxicated. Yeah.
Right. And that's very interesting in particular because my co-author, Charles Chang, works a lot on heritage language effects. And in fact, well, some of his findings are very interesting, that even a heritage language that you seem to have forgotten quite a bit, at least with respect to phonetic precision, sticks around quite a bit for some subtle phonetic differences. His is one of the studies that I like because we're all familiar here, I think, with Ellen Bialystok and the general work that looks at the cognitive advantage of bilingualism, right? And so how speaking more than one language as simultaneous, not sequential bilingual, might improve your executive function on various inhibition tasks. And, whether you have to press this button, whether this changes or that. And Kovac and Mailer studied this with 8-month-olds and so forth. But what I like about Charles Chang's work is that it shows that even heritage speakers have an advantage that's perceptual. And so there are even fine perceptual differences to that exposure. So I think that's something I'd like to share with him. I don't think he's here, but I'd be happy to share with him and see how he comes back to you. And Mikhail says, were your participants likely to guess the purpose of the study? I don't think anyone was able to guess that we were specifically looking at pitch. So from that perspective, no, I don't think that it is an issue sometimes, but I don't think, and that's another reason why the plays were perhaps a good guise, because they were so absorbed by the content of this play and why this play, and why was it the case that the Germans, for example, showed this variability in their pitch, but the other two speakers did not.
I'm just
yes, Masha?
I'm sorry, can I make a follow-up on that? I'm just wondering if you asked your participants, like what they thought the purpose of the study was, as is often done, right, in psycholinguistic research. Because they were aware that there was a manipulation, right?
Sure.
And so
yeah,
so probably thought that you were looking at some effects of alcohol.
Yes.
I'm just curious what kind of effects they thought you might be interested in. Or they were not curious about that. They would just comply with the task and do whatever they were asked to do.
I think they thought it was so fun to be paid to get drunk and read plays that they didn't reflect on it too much. But we do have those pieces of paper stored somewhere with the questionnaire, and again, it's not often the kind of thing that you can look at quantitatively afterwards so usefully, but it's interesting perhaps to dig those out. Someone in the chat asked for my email address, so I'll just type it in the chat box in case it's not wasn't available in my slides or on any of the NYI related materials. There it is. Masha? Masha,
Yeah. So I don't really have a question, more like thoughts, if that's okay. So one thought is, so it seemed to me that you were talking about the difference between tonal languages and German, so a non-tonal language, in terms of how much control you have over your F0. But could we frame it in terms of how much control you need? Right. So what if, speakers of tonal language, even when drunk, they still need to have more control over their production because, they still have to do the tones, whereas it's less crucial in a language like German. So it's not like they cannot have this control. They just don't need to. So they let go, basically, because it doesn't matter. Like if you need to have a pitch accent somewhere, it doesn't matter how drastic, like how high this pitch accent is going to be. If it's high enough to be identifiable as high, then just go super high, right? Why not? Right. So that's one thought. Like basically, maybe it's less about how much control you have, but how much control you need to preserve, no matter how drunk you are. And another one. So going back to my earlier comment about affect. So I'm still not, and someone else's comment about cultural differences, I'm still not convinced that we can like properly control for potential cultural differences in this respect. So, you know, what if in some cultures it's just more acceptable to show that you're drunk, essentially? And like maybe relatedly, what if in some cultures it's more acceptable to express affect through prosody, especially when you're drunk, right? And so they start doing it more when they're drunk, while other people remain more quote unquote reserved. Right. So I'm again, I mean, these are thoughts rather than questions, but I don't know if you want to comment on this.
The second one is an excellent point, and certainly something that I've thought about, and that I won't say keeps me up at night, but you know, this is the equivalent of what would be keeping people up at night. I sleep like a log every day, but it keeps me up at night because figuratively. Because I am worried about that. You know, how do we know that the results might not necessarily be due to kind of social behavior related to drinking, right? And so social behavior related to drinking cross-culturally may, now I don't know that, but I don't really know. Then I would really have to study more. I mean, I know that there's a lot of alcohol related karaoke in Korean cultures that, you know, seems to have no problem with expanded pitch range, and so I don't really know enough yet. It's something that I'm concerned about. But again, what I can do, and I say this all the time, my expertise is really linguistics, phonology, linguistics. So I often follow hypotheses that I understand, unlike hypotheses that I don't understand well enough yet. But I certainly would welcome collaboration with people who understand that better. And I don't think that it's obvious that that's an explanation here. And it's related also to your first point, right? Your first point was, well, how much do you need versus how much can you control in your first language, given that it's a tone language. But still, what's very surprising is that this carries over to the second language, right? So you don't need any control in your second language, and yet people still maintain it, right? So the Mandarin speakers, the Korean speakers, sure, maybe we could reframe things in your terms about how much do they need for appropriateness of a target in terms of contrast and like. But then when they go to English, they don't need any of that, and still they retain it. So that's what I find to be surprising and compelling, and something that I think, the kind of research we were nominated. Some of you may know about what's called an Ig Nobel Prize. This is a very interesting category of research for things that make you certainly laugh at how preposterous research is, but then later scratch your head at the fact that there actually is something to think about here. And we didn't get it, but we were nominated for it. And I find that to be a great honor, even though most people think it's for ridiculous research, because it's kind of, and I recommend the Ig Nobels. You guys should look at it. When they have studies like cows that have names produce more milk than cows that don't have names. How can somebody study that? And you think about it, you say, well, if you say, come over here, Bessie, and you say, come over here, number 7, then maybe there's more prosody that leads to, cows being happier and so forth and so forth. So, this is the kind of research that I hope will make people then scratch their head and realize that there's something to be Snobelevskaya Premia. That's the Ig Nobels, huh? That's something that I think remains open with your point, at least the way you stated it.
Can I have a very quick follow-up, because I'm kind of ignorant about some of this research. So do we know how much, so when Mandarin speakers or Korean speakers or speakers of like whatever tonal languages, when they learn a language like English, do they hallucinate tones in English? Like I know when I'm exposed to languages that don't have lexical stress, for instance, in the same way as Russian does, I simply hallucinate lexical stress there. And if I were to produce words in those languages, which I'm not fluent in any such, well, I guess French doesn't have lexical stress, but whatever. I still create lexical stress there, right? So going back to your point about, well, Mandarin speakers, Korean speakers don't need tones in English. What if they think they do? I mean, not consciously, right? But what if they actually create a tonal structure when they speak English? And I don't know. I mean, I'm sure someone has studied that. I'm ignorant about this literature.
That's really interesting. That's extremely interesting. Thank you for that question. Adam Shekelniak and I, many years ago, did some teaching together with Nigerian Pidgin English, where we talked a bit about the imposition of tones on English from West African languages, tonal languages, even though the English doesn't necessarily have tone. So that's sort of a well understood case. But with respect to our specific populations, I haven't seen as much. And that's really interesting. And that would suggest that perhaps one of the reasons why, again, there is this retention of pitch control in L2 is that speakers, as you say, hallucinate, as it were, no absinthe necessary, a kind of tonal structure, even in a language that doesn't have it. Basil, I saw you here, and I think that's one of the reasons why, and right above Adam, actually, on my screen. And so I sort of threw that out as a hook to see if you had anything to say about it.
Well, it depends on the particular question you want to find out. I know that the tone, Nigerian Pidgin, for example, has two major tones. That is the low and the high. And sometimes it also reflects in the syntax. So you can ask question by just changing the tone without the structure, without any movement of the, without any rearrangement of the words within the sentence, unlike English. So it's also accepted. That's all. And also not just the tone, even the grammar, like in the inflections, most inflectional elements in English and some other languages are reflected through lexical means in Nigerian Pidgin. So if I say, I don't do, I have done it. So you don't change the verb. So the do remains do, but you can put a word that usually occurs before the verb to indicate whether you're talking about past, present, or any other thing, or future. So many other things.
Yeah, so I thank you very much for sharing that, because I think what you've said also does partly confirm this idea that there's a transfer of some of the tonal targets you might have in your first language, or one speaks a collection of languages.
Yes.
And it actually makes me think
like the tone of, in fact, the most of the transfers come from Kwa languages. Like I speak Igbo as my first language. So Igbo tone is, Igbo features, both phonology, morphology, syntax is there. The same with Yoruba. For someone who speaks Yoruba, you see that the structure is there. Even the issue of serial verb constructions and other things that occur in both Yoruba and Igbo also happens in Nigerian Pidgin. So Nigerian Pidgin is like a Kwa language wearing the toga of English. So the leg fire is English, but the grammar, the phonology, and most of it come from the Kwa language.
Yeah, so I would think that confirms kind of what Masha was saying. And actually what that makes me think a bit about is, and I think this comes up a lot, we wanted to classify our speakers as being fluent in English, based on their scores on IELTS, however you pronounce that, the TOEFL, the TOEFL, however you pronounce that, and the Lextail. But is it an interesting question of whether or not we should maybe classify fluency specifically, maybe for the purposes of this kind of experiment, on prosody also? And prosody is one of the things that's taught. Well, in Russian it was taught to me from the start, but in other languages, prosody is not one of the things that's taught right away to speakers. I once did a study, and I found fluent Italian speakers who were fluent in English with respect to difficult syntactic constructions, with respect to difficult segmental phonology, so they had no problem with the th, with the th, no problem with the e contrast. But then I would do a test with them. I'd say, what happened? And they'd say, you dropped something, not you dropped something, right? And that was evidence that the rule in English that says, or why is Freddie in jail? He killed someone, not he killed someone. And the rule in English that says that when the object is indefinite in English, nuclear stress should move back. Or in fact, even in a pair like, do you like tennis? I say, do you like tennis? And my interlocutor will say, no, I hate sports. They won't say, do you like tennis? No, I hate sports, right? No one will say that. And so whenever the category is already entailed, is an indefinite or is a hypernym that's entailed, nuclear stress moves back. Fluent Italian speakers, fluent both in fine points of morphosyntax and in segmental phonetics, still didn't get that. And what that suggests to me is that maybe our criteria for fluency in an L2, and maybe people's in general, should take into account prosody and intonation as well. Otherwise, we might literally just be seeing people who replicate their L2 effects from their L1 because they've still got a strong accent, hallucinated or otherwise, from prosodic transfer. Yeah, so very nice points of discussion. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one other question. It's 7 p.m. here in London. So been in the office a long time. That's part of participating in NYI, global jet lag.
Well, it's
No?
it's here in New York, it's 2:15, and that's exactly the target time. So
Great.
that's perfect. Thank you, Andrew, so much.
I'm very
This is
happy.
really
If anyone
interesting.
wants to follow up with me by email or otherwise, I have maybe some Courvoisier buried somewhere else near in the office, but it's I don't, and it's a little embarrassing. So yeah,
The
cheers.
very
Now, get
end
down.
of a bottle
Cheers.
of Glenlivet. That's where
Fancy,
we
John.
stop. That's where
Yeah,
we stop
Macedonia.
streaming, right? Time to
And,
stop streaming, Jihan.
And yeah,
Before
thank
we
you all
get
for your
in serious
participation, and I wish
trouble.
everyone a wonderful school.